Hi, everyone. I'm Carter Foster. I'm Deputy Director for Curatorial Affairs and Curator of Prints and Drawings at the Blanton Museum of Art. Thank you for joining us tonight. I hope you have a drink and enjoying happy hour or a mocktail. I am joined by my wonderful colleagues from the Blanton, our Curator of Latin American Art, Vanessa Davidson. Hi, Vanessa.
Hello.
Our curatorial assistant for prints and drawings, Genevra Higginson, and it was Genevra's idea, this program, so thank you for this great idea, Genevra.
Thank you. I'm so jazzed to be here.
Good, it's great to have you. We're also joined by our UT Austin doctoral candidate, Phillip Townsend, who is getting his PhD, but also has worked at the Blanton and co-curated the Charles White exhibition and co-authored the catalog that we did a few months ago in conjunction with Art Galleries of Black Studies. So thanks so much for joining us, Phillip.
Thanks for having me.
I'm going to go into go into just some housekeeping. If you're participating in this, your audio is muted, so we can't hear you. So you can scream all you want, but you'll see us, and we're going to take questions from the Q&A window. During the presentation, please use the Q&A window rather than the chat function. That's where we try to monitor the questions. And I think we'll go ahead and get started. We got 70 people, that's great. So the image I'm gonna start with is not owned by the Blanton, I wish it was, but I chose it, or we chose it because it's probably, I would say it's probably the most famous image of a flag, at least in American art in the 20th century. It's by the artist Jasper Johns. It's something that he did early in his career that sort of helped establish him. And it's often read as a kind of bridge between abstract expressionism, which was this very loose painterly style, and the developing pop movement, although the work predates it. Sometimes it's put in this category called hand-painted pop. But Jasper Johns, as the story goes, he literally dreamed he painted an American flag, and he set out to do that the next day, and that's what he did. And he used an unusual technique called encaustic, in which pigment is embedded in wax, to create this beautiful painterly surface, which is also depicting a flat icon, a flat sign and symbol, a flag, which of course is you know, if you're painting your flat surface, so he picks an object with a flat surface so that the surface of the object and the surface of the painting are the same thing. Most people that have written about his work, and many critics and art historians talk about it in not so much in political terms. They talk about, you know, as I said, the bridge between abstract expressionism and pop. And also about linguistics, about questioning the nature of the sign, teasing out the ambiguities of a sign, and things like that. But the thing is, if you choose to depict a flag, of course it's a political statement in one regard or another, whatever you know, the other intentions you might want to serve. And if you think about when this work was painted, it's post-war, it's the height of the Cold War, it's sort of in America in the 50s, which, you know, was certainly a time of repression for many people. It was before the Civil Rights Movement. Jasper Johns was in a relationship with the artist Robert Rauschenberg at the time, a romantic relationship. So, you know, there's aspects of this repressive culture that they lived in and couldn't, you know, be themselves in. And he's deciding to depict an American flag. So that's the Jasper Johns. And that's his version of the American flag. But there is another, my colleague Vanessa is now going to talk about other American flags, though not North American flags, South American flags. So I'll hand it over to you, Vanessa.
Thank you. Yes, so as it happens, the next two artists we're going to talk about were also living in New York City, where Jasper Johns was living around the same time, a few decades later. This is a work by José Antonio Fernández Muro. It's called Al Gran Pueblo Argentino, ... It's to the great Argentine nation, and then ellipses. And what I think is so remarkable about this is that it was created in 1964, the year after he and his wife, Sara Grillo, who's also a very well-known informalist painter, moved to New York. And he became fascinated, not only, he was a painter of lyrical geometries before moving to New York, but in New York he became fascinated by the grit and by the textures around the city. whereas his wife, Sarah, was fascinated by the graffiti. So they kind of diverged. They went in different directions. They were painting in very similar directions, and they diverged because what he would do, as you see in this piece, is that he would go out with aluminum foil, basically aluminum paper, and emboss manholes, which is what you see at the center of this work, as well as letters and numbers from street signs. So that if you flip to the next slide, what's even more curious about it, Stacy, if you go to the next slide, is that it very much resembles an Argentine flag, which you see here. And this interpretation of the work as a symbol of the Argentine flag is heightened by the fact that the title to the great Argentine people, ... is actually part of the national anthem. And the last word after that ... is salud, which means good health. And you see that down at the bottom of the painting. So he was working on this in the 60s, the mid 60s, when Argentina was just starting its roiling, kind of chaotic transition from a civilian government to military dictatorship, which escalated into the dirty war, although he denied any political meetings in his paintings. The next artist we're going to talk about, Antonio Enrique Amaral, did not deny political symbolism. If you go to the next slide, Stacy, this is called Sozinho em Verde, or Alone in Green, and it was painted also while he was living in New York in 1973. Enrique Amaral is known for what are called his banana paintings, which he created between about 1968 and about 1978. As we go to the next slide, I want to read to you a quote that I think is very revelatory. He said, "The banana was born as a gesture, a satirical approach, because what did the military dictatorship do in Brazil? In 1964, Brazil was an optimistic place with the building of Brasilia and a vital automobile industry. We had a kind of future, and suddenly the military transformed us into a big banana republic. It was something I wanted to show sardonically. It was subtle. I was not going to jail, forget about that, because it was ridiculous to censor bananas. It was something that they wouldn't dare. It's like, why are you censoring this painting? Because it's a banana." And this is the first of the banana painting. It's called Boa Vizinhança, which really means good neighborhood, and refers, of course, to the US's good neighbor policy that was instituted in the 30s as a way of trying to get closer to Latin American nations and preventing the spread of communism in the countries to the south of their borders. And it also happens that Brazil at this time was the world's primary exporter of bananas. So what you see here is a portrayal of the American and the Brazilian flags together, tied together by this banana. But if you go to the next slide, Stacy, by the early to mid 1970s, the bananas become bruised and mutilated and broken, and symbols of the Brazilian people who were tortured and persecuted and repressed under dictatorship, which lasted from 1964 until 1985. And what you see here on the right, of course, is the Brazilian flag. And I included that image because Amaral has painted this banana in the colors of yellow, blue, and green, the colors of the Brazilian flag. So I think that using the banana in this kind of pop language, but so far removed from the commercial pop of the US, but while living in the US, is so significant, especially because he adopts this symbol as a way of escaping and avoiding persecution. And if you go to the next slide, you'll also see continuations of some of these ideas, which Philip will talk about next.
Yeah. So David Hammond's Injustice Case is perhaps one of my favorite works by David Hammond. Injustice Case is perhaps one of the most well-known of his body prints. Many of his works from that period, from the late 1960s to early 1970s, were created by deploying the body as a paintbrush and using oil-based mediums like margarine or grease as paint. In this work, you see the artist in profile. He's violently bound to a chair and he's gagged. The print is superimposed against an actual US flag that looks, kind of dingy, kind of subtle in comparison with the stark white print. And Hammonds erased the pigment marks and the residue from the background to create this super clean, super crisp image. As in much contemporary art during this period, this piece relates to a specific event, the trial of Bobby Seale. He was the co-founder of the Black Panther Party. In 1969, Seale was indicted in Chicago for conspiracy to incite riots during the Democratic National Convention, which were held the previous year. The court refused, for some strange reason, refused to allow him to have his choice of lawyer. And when Seale repeatedly rose to voice his opinions about being denied his constitutional rights to counsel, the judge, in a very bizarre twist of events, ordered him to be bound and gagged. Seale was later sentenced to prison for 4 years for contempt of court, not on the conspiracy charges as they were dismissed. However, due to the unconstitutionality of the proceedings, Seale's sentence was eventually overturned. The trial was widely publicized, and this drawing, which was also widely distributed, became a sign of the injustice of the American legal system, particularly for African Americans at that time. Like Seale, the image of the contorted and bound figure that we see here at the center of the composition appears not to be afforded the ideals of freedom, equality, and justice for all that we come to know or that is symbolized by the flag that frames the picture. Despite the right to peaceful protest afforded to us by the US Constitution, the bound figure speaks to state-sanctioned violence executed against Black citizens in the US over the course of many centuries, especially those citizens who have criticized the government's racist and discriminatory police practices. The translucent quality of the print that we see here resembles a photographic negative, and it gestures towards this idea of absence of political rights. And right now, we see these sentiments echoed in the Black Lives Matter protests, which are inspired in part by the extrajudicial killing of George Floyd, and also in part by the government's violent reaction to this uprising. In essence, Hammonds, with Injustice Case, is holding up the flag and asking us to question who has access to the freedoms and protections that the flag promises to provide us. And Stacey, if you go to the next slide.
Can I just say one thing about the Hammonds? Can you go back, Stacey? Sorry, there's a couple of incredible things about it to me. The technique that he uses, he's actually using his own body to press against the paper. So as I recall, this work is life size. You know, he's using, is that right, Phillip? I think it is. Again, we don't own this work. It's owned by the LA County Museum. And he's using an actual flag, but I think using the bars of the flag, the stripes of the flags like bars to a prison is really this brilliant conceptual gesture that he does. And I was reading about this today, and also it reminded me of a work by Dred Scott, who did a piece when he was a graduate student in Chicago, where he essentially invites the viewer to step on the flag, and it became this whole court case. And so, you know, this work, and then the Supreme Court decided in Dred Scott's favor, and that's why we're allowed to burn the flag if we want to as an act of free speech. But Hammond's choosing to use a real flag is a really strong statement, it seems to me, in this work.
Right.
Thank you.
And Faith Ringgold. Let me start by saying that Faith Ringgold is perhaps one of my favorite artists. Her oil paintings and posters from the mid-1960s carried a strong political message, really announcing or declaring her support for the civil rights movement. She demonstrated against the exclusion of Black women artists from the Whitney and MoMA from 1968, 1970. She was arrested, ironically, for desecrating the American flag in 1970 as a participant in the People's Flag Show. So totally different from Dred Scott, where his case went to the Supreme Court. Faith Ringgold was actually arrested for doing the same action. So Mother Ringgold has a special place in my heart. But this work, Flag for the Moon, was created in response to the first image from the Apollo 11 moon landing, which showed the American flag planted in the surface of the moon through this very vast, dark vacuum of space. And the piece portrays the American flag with a few editorial revisions. Embedded among the gray stars of Old Glory is the word die. So you can see it embedded with the stars. And the flag stripes have been replaced with the N-word rendered in abstract lettering. So despite its obscurity, the message is very clear, the command is very clear, and it's a testament to the reality of the enduring legacy of racism and prejudice in this country that is still apparent in the fabric of our society today. In part, the work sort of highlights the misplaced priorities of the US government. You know, when you think about it, in the 1960s, it's a century after the Emancipation Proclamation, and African Americans, particularly those that are living in the South, are still, you know, marred and being denied access to good housing, quality education, employment, and basic amenities. You know, of course, there were gains made, significant gains in that period. We had the 1954 Supreme Case Course, Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, and we had the success of the Montgomery bus boycott the following year in '55. And you know, these gains encouraged many people to believe that racism will be eradicated and perhaps, you know, tamped down. As a result, many within the African American community entered the 1960s with this belief that nonviolent protest was the key. Legal action could help make a difference, and mistakenly, they thought that the government would somehow be an active participant and making racial equality its priority. And we have to acknowledge the contributions that were made with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It was a significant moment, but also in that moment, we were dealt two significant blows: the assassination of Malcolm X in '65 and Dr. King in '68. And the deaths of these prolific figures, along with other leaders and participants of the civil rights movement, demonstrated to Black people and to the world, quite frankly, that despite the significant legislation that ended segregation in public spaces and banned employment discrimination, that it was abundantly clear that Black Americans were not protected from physical violence and death at the hands of white supremacy. So if we think about this context, then we can read this work as a disruption or a challenge to the narrative of national harmony that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the planning of the US flag and the moon attempted to sell to the country and, quite frankly, to the world.
And artists like her saw the planting of the flag on the moon as a colonialist gesture. You know, they didn't see it as a positive thing. And I recommend to everyone, if you don't know it, to go look on YouTube for Gil Scott-Heron's amazing spoken word piece called Whitey on the Moon, which was on a 1970 album that he did around the same time. And it's commenting on the exact same thing. And he's an amazing figure from this time.
Okay. So one poster number 6, Will Charles White. But also one poster number 6 is perhaps one of my top 10 Celia works of all time. The work is intricately made. It has layers of references, iconography, and basically contemporary application. In this work, if you look closely between the Confederate and the US flag, White blurs the divide between these flags, suggesting that they share some similarities, especially around their ideologies regarding Black people. For example, the text that we see that spans across the torso of the Black female figure and around the figure of the Black child, that text is taken from Article 4, Section 2 of the US Constitution. So in enacting way back in 1793, this article permitted slave catchers to apprehend runaway slaves and return them to their owners. But at that time, the action was limited within the borders of states that permitted slavery. Well, in 1850, to remedy that restriction, the Fugitive Slave Act, or Slave Clause, was added to expand the extradition of runaway slaves from states that had outlawed slavery. So in essence, rendering self-emancipation virtually impossible. That law remained part of the federal law until its ratification of the 13th Amendment in 1865. And much like the Unjustice case, Stacey, can you switch to the next slide? Wanted poster sort of responds to a contemporaneous moment. So if you think about the way that Unjustice case responds to the case of Bobby Seale, Wanted poster 6 is responding to this commission report by Patrick Moynihan called The Negro Family, the Case for National Action. Now we call it the Moynihan Report. And basically this report focused on the roots of Black poverty in the US and essentially blamed Black women for the socioeconomic status of Black Americans. So in part, Moynihan argued that slavery gave birth to a Black woman who was capable of running her household, thereby weakening the ability of Black men to function as husbands and as fathers, and that she alone contributed to lower educational outcomes of Black children. His report went so far as to suggest that even if the government and the white world, I'll put that in quotes, it was part of the report, even if the white world provided resources beyond civil rights legislation to Black people, Black matriarchy was so powerful that it would render all of the assistance ineffective. And basically that report was in an attempt to stymie any sort of legislative progress and tamping down on racial violence Black people were experiencing at that time. So for me, wanted poster number 6 highlights how critical Black women have been to the structure of white supremacy. So if you look at the top image with the Black women being prominent within the Confederate X, the Confederacy needed Black women to provide a constant source of equity and labor to maintain its power. And also when we consider her in relation to the United States, in this report, we see that the US used the Black woman as a scapegoat in an attempt to divert its responsibility for Black poverty. Can you just go to the next slide, Stacey? So one-in poster number 10 is, this work is equally as compelling as any of the other works that are inside of the one-in poster series. And it draws attention to the commodification of Black people, particularly children, by the US government. And vulnerability is a huge part of this work. So if you take a look at the figure of the child crouched at the top of the frame, it recalls the position in which enslaved Africans assumed in the stuffed cargo holds of slave ships. And if you look closely, there are words that on both sides of the figure of the baby that's swaddled in fabric. And it reads, "Know ye, States has purchased Negroes for the sum of dollars, terms of sale insured." So this phrasing and its topography have been appropriated from runaway slave advertisements and slave auction notices. Stacey, can you go to the next slide? So the topography comes from this image or these slave notices that White stumbled across on a research trip with his good friend and renowned sociologist, Dr. Edmund Gordon, who I had the opportunity of sharing the name of a fellowship at Blanton a few years ago. The title and its stylings of one-in poster number 6 find inspiration from these documents. The folds and creases of these documents that you can see in the slave notice come from a carrier folding the document and stuffing it in its pockets, while White mimics that effect through shade and shadow in one poster using Q-tips and a range of other materials, but also through other light manipulating techniques. But what is of extreme interest for me in this work, in this current moment, is this idea of vulnerability. And if we look at the flag in the background, this abstract rendering of the flag highlights just how discriminately notions of equality and protection and justice, freedom and liberty are applied in this nation. So if you're not a cis white man, then historically in this country, you've had to fight for these rights. And arguably in this moment, the most vulnerable populations that are fighting for these rights right now are two-spirit, trans women, and femmes of color. You know, they face higher rates of poverty, harassment, violence, poor health, limited job opportunities, and isolation from the larger LGBTQ community. And as a nation, we must work toward justice and equality for our transgender and gender nonconforming people, but we also need to urge our government to live up to its charge of ensuring that we all are protected under its flag. And it's a flag that many people of color have served up under, including Charles White, who was drafted into the military in 1944. And I think Barbara Jones-Hogu of Genevra is going to take over that.
Thank you, Phillip.
Yeah, so just as Phillip and everyone has been discussing, national flags, in order to be effective, need to be recognizable, memorable, and legible from a distance. Even if you're standing, you know, hundreds of feet away and the flag is waving in the wind, you need to be able to identify what that flag is. And in a very similar vein, the artists were discussing or adapting the language of these national flags to clearly and emphatically state expanded narratives of what those flags might identify or fail to identify. And so they're trying to make visible those truths that are easily ignored by ruling classes and those who benefit from the power structures that embed inequality into every facet of society. And Barbara Jones-Hogu, she was a printmaker in Chicago, multimedia artist, but best known for her prints. She studied at Howard University, the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and then was doing her master's degree at the Illinois Institute of Technology, Institute of Design. And it was there that she started really experimenting with printmaking and delighting in the experimentation that printmaking techniques allow you to do. She was originally drawn a little bit more towards woodblock printmaking, but unfortunately her very expensive wood cutting tools were stolen, and it led her down this path towards silk screen and screen printing. And screen printing, I think, is a really interesting technique because it's using sort of a series of stencils, and we've seen in those Charles White works the integration of stenciling as part of the visual language of these works of protest, resistance. And here it becomes part of the visual language knit throughout the entire sheet of paper. So the piece on the left, Land Where My Father Died, well, both of these pieces were part of her thesis series, what she called her America series of prints. And so in these prints, she's taking the elements of the American flag, the stars, the stripes, red, white, and blue, and reimagining them. And part of that reimagination of flags is to create kind of a rhythm of visual cadence so that your eye is following the lines that she's created through this system of stencils and printmaking in order to reveal new truths. So if you look at The Land Where My Father Died, I hope that you can notice within the stars are actually Klansmen. They're members of the Ku Klux Klan with their white hoods and their tiny little beady eyes staring out at you. And when you're looking at these objects in person, those eyes you'll see that they're in every single star. I mean, it's really quite omnipresent. And you'll also notice that the stripes, the red and white stripes in that print are tessellated. And as your eye follows their geometric patterning, you'll realize that they're actually swastikas. So this is a technique that Jones Hogu called the lost and found line. And it's asking you, instead of looking for contour lines or black outlines, she's asking you really to see the way in which the shapes work together and knit a new unit. And she's really about unity. And so there is no direct delineation between one form and the next, except in the patterning itself and the colors themselves. And you can see like her use of color is really quite remarkable. The gradient of skin tones on the figures who are rising up against that oppressive flag, that takes a technique called glue resist. So she's actually applying glue onto the screens themselves and then uses a special touche and oil-based ink so that once the glue basically stops out where the printing of the inks applies. She's actually incorporating material resistance into these works of resistance as well. And then in Nation Time, the image on the right, you see again the same Klansmen stars, but here we have figures foregrounded. There's this looming black figure in the front, and she described that person as sort of leading this cohort in unity against the oppression of the American flag. She talked about having a commitment as a people to the struggles of African people who are waging war for survival and liberation, not just in the US, but anywhere on the planet too. Stacy, if you move to the next slide, please.
I can just point out real quick, Genevra, that Jones Hogu comes out of that Chicago area, which was known for producing fervent artists. I mean, we think about poet Gwendolyn Brooks, photographer Gordon Parks, artists like Margaret Burroughs, Elizabeth Catlett, Charles Davis, Bernard Ghost, and of course, Charles White, were just a few of the many artists working in that vein of social activism, similar to Jones Hogu.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this print comes after Barbara Jones Hogu has started working on with a team of artists to establish AfriCobra, which is the African Commune of Bad Relevant Artists. And they created a visual aesthetic that was quite radical and innovative in its language. And Phillip, do you want to talk a little bit about that visual aesthetic that they developed?
Certainly. I mean, so part of the manifesto of AfriCobra was thinking about the way that they were connecting to Africa. So these undulating lines that you see in the work sort of corresponds to their idea of thinking about colors as being responding to music and African movement. And one of the things that they talked about is like having these bold colors that were sort of reminiscent or representative of the people that were interested or sort of committed to making their voices heard. And the very the smoothness that you see within the figure's face is similar to what you see in Charles White, was sort of like thinking about the way that the body could mimic or take on the contours of the afro. And you see that in these works quite prominently.
Yeah, absolutely. And in a 1973 essay that Jones Hogu wrote referencing that manifesto and their ideology, she writes, "Black, positive, direct statements created in bright, vivid, singing Kool-Aid colors of orange, strawberry, lemon, lime, and grape. Pure, vivid colors of the sun and nature, colors that shine on Black people, colors which stand out against the greenery of rural areas." And I love that. And I think there is a really lyrical quality to so many of these objects that Jones Hogu printed and created. And here you see those Kool-Aid colors, the way that that orange just glows off the purple paper to create these faces. And it does almost become its own sort of sunset. So where the earlier images from her thesis print, America series, are really quite emphatic in the urgency and necessity of rising up against these systems of oppression. When she turned to Afrocobra, she tried to take that same visual terminology, but give it a little bit more of a positive impetus so that there was a way forward. So it's still very adamant in its recognition and narration of systems of oppression, but it's also saying there is a way forward and there is a radical way for us to unite. And so this is part of her Unity series. And she really does emphasize sort of the inherent beauty and heroicism and potential of Black bodies. And so here we see these glowing colors, but in other instances, she actually used metallic inks, gold inks, to show the inherent value of these images that she is depicting.
Her use of color in both the paper and the inks is really extraordinary and so innovative. I mean, I don't really know other artists experimenting like that.
It's so innovative, and she was really particular about it. She only used oil-based inks. She actually turned away from printmaking in the mid-1970s because her son, she did a lot of her printmaking at home, and her son was getting sick from the fumes of the oil-based ink, and she didn't like the effects of the other inks. She's like, they're not giving me that same like really punchy quality. And you want that vibrancy and the really legibility of such bold, graphic, vivid colors. So yeah, it was a big part of her choice making. And the paper on which she's printing these objects is Japanese paper, because it was much sturdier than some of the other papers that were too fragile and just wouldn't hold up to the impact or the statement of her work. Stacey, if you can move on to the next slide, please.
So there's a question, is the paper itself purple or is it printed purple?
Yes, that is purple paper. And 2 slides back, that impression of nation time and the different composition, that is gold paper. So she also talks about actually choosing, you can see, so the land where my father died is white paper, and that's the earliest piece that we have at the Blanton collection and the earliest of these 3 images. She moved away from using white paper backgrounds as part of her color theory. She thought that by using a paper ground that integrated the entire composition, she could unify her message more clearly. And so you can see the gold coming through on the faces of some of these figures in nation time. It becomes part of the composition in a way that is luminous as opposed to stifling in the way that that kind of omnipresent whiteness is quite terrifying in the context in which she's using it.
Great, thank you.
Now we return to the Hispanic world, the Hispano-American world actually, to discuss 2 Chicano artists and the ways in which they use the flag. This is a very different image than the ones we've just seen. What you're looking at here is an image by Vicente Bautista, who is a Chicano or Mexican-American artist. And what he's depicting here is an economic ecosystem that has arisen at the border due to the great demand for peoples who are oppressed and facing civil war or repression and gang life. rife in their cities in Latin America, trying to get across the border from Mexico into the United States. So this is the coyote. Literally translated is it's the coyotes. And they, if you pay them a hefty sum, will help to smuggle you over the border. So you see the American flag literally coming out on his tongue, and you have to, if you want to follow that dream, you have to follow it into the coyote's barbed teeth into his mouth, describing the treacherous and perilous journey that many have suffered in order to cross into America, hoping for a better life for them and their children. The next image is much more hopeful. This is an image by Manuel Gomez Cruz. Stacy, if you go to the next slide. Thank you very much. This is actually a flag that he created called the Barrio flag. Barrio, as you all know, means neighborhood in Spanish, and is applied in Hispano-American communities across the country to describe those neighborhoods. Manuel Gomez Cruz plays a very important role in Chicano art. He's considered one of the godfathers of Chicano art due to his involvement with arts organizations beginning in the 1970s and continuing into the 1990s when this was created. And this is actually him quoting himself from a mural that he created on a wall on East Cesar Chavez Street in Los Angeles. And what you have here is the conflation of imagery from the American ideology of the bald eagle, the United Farm Workers Union flag, as well as the Aztec or Mexican flag, which depicts an eagle holding a serpent in its talons. And yet what you have on the swag of fabric beneath says Barrios United is peace and power. And if you look closely, you'll see that there are hands of every color coming together. So Barrios United, not only Chicano barrios who might be confronting one another in gang violence, but all barrios, all neighborhoods coming together is peace and power, is what he's advocating in this beautiful barrio flag from 1996. And I believe that goes to the next image, which is handing the baton back to Genevra.
Yeah, so continuing with these prints, this is a print by Vito Acconci, who is really best known for his work as a performance artist in the 60s and 70s, but actually he was trained originally as a poet. And when he, after doing his master's degree at the Iowa Writers Workshop, he returned to New York and was practicing as a poet. And it was through his poetry readings that he sort of turned into a performance artist. And as his art evolved, it really does sort of look at these ideas of body, word, and city and community. And so here, this is a piece that was developed by Acconci originally as a project proposal. He, by the late 80s, he had actually developed an architecture design studio where he was hoping to sort of work against sort of traditional forces of architecture that can create very rigid ways in which we move through the world and continue to sort of literally build spaces that dictate systems of hierarchy, essentially. And he wanted to take art and sort of use it as a tool to deconstruct some of those traditional architectural systems. So this was a project proposal for the St. Louis Convention Center that never came into realization. Originally, the idea was that this concept would be put onto mirrored stainless steel panels. And then the words of the Pledge of Allegiance would be etched into this wavering flag in red, white, and blue neon lights. As I've mentioned a few times, it didn't happen, but we have this phenomenal print as a testament to the concept, and it's really monumental. It's 12 feet long. It's 6 individual sheets of paper. And I just want to zoom in on a few of the symbols. So Stacy, if you'll move to the next slide, thank you. You'll see that what he's doing is really playing with space. And what you're trying to do here is as a viewer, you're kind of overwhelmed by the size of this and confronted by it. And so as you as a viewer are reading all of these sort of drop down and raised up words, you're the one who is enacting the site of protest and of question. So you'll see that pledge becomes peg and edge, and flag becomes fag, allege becomes all, but also allege. Here in the center panel, public becomes pubic. And then in the last panel, indivisible becomes visible, but also divisible. Liberty becomes lie, and all, liberty and justice for all, which is the way our pledge ends, all is completely obscured. You can't really see it at all. So again, it's just continuing this lineage of graphic artists who are using the sign of an American flag or any national flag as a way to reconstruct it as a site of protest. And Vito Acconci talks about very explicitly in his works, he said, for a space to really work, it has to liberate people. So even this artist who is a white cisgendered male, he is entering spaces that have been traditional opportunities for just, you know, the continuation of Jeffersonian architecture or whatever the case may be, and to confront that and really make us question the space itself, almost insert parentheses into a physical space so that we're pausing and questioning the ways in which we move through the world. And so he talks about how that's the advantage of coming in from the outside as not an architect, but an artist entering that space. He's coming in from a different point of view, from a marginal point of view. And by making those notes on the margin, by taking the Pledge of Allegiance and annotating it, essentially, he is reinventing the narrative and helping us reanalyze these things that we've been taught since kindergarten. With that, I think we return to Vanessa, the next slide.
Yes, and in terms of rewriting the canon and reimagining the flag, this is a work by Pablo Vargas Lugo, who's a Mexican artist. What you're seeing here are flags that are inspired by butterfly wings. And so what he does in his work is very varied and very vast, but in this particular series, the new vexillology series, and new vexillology actually means the study of flags, what he does is to create these beautiful patterns, these beautiful flags, makeshift flags, out of the wings of the colors, the patterns and the wings of butterflies. So if you go to the next slide, please, Stacy, you'll see how this plays out in an exhibition that he had in Puebla in 2014, and he called this mariposario, which doesn't really translate very well, but really means butterfly enclosure, or butterfly house, or butterfly pavilion. All of these 70 invented flags are based upon colors and patterns of butterfly wings. And what he's doing in this series, he's stated, is to question the ways in which governments appropriate natural symbols like stars or vegetation or colors or patterns to make power seem natural, to make it seem inherent to their regimes. And another way of thinking about this, I think, is to untether the flag from its moorings, to reinvent its colors, and to present it as something as beautiful as a butterfly about to fly into the sky in this wonderful atrium at the Museo Amparo. And with that, I think we'll move to the next slide. Now, what you're looking at here is the Chilean artist Alfredo Jar's logo for America. And what you're seeing here is it was commissioned by the Public Art Fund, and it played for 2 weeks on the Jumbotron in Times Square in 1987. And it was met with great outrage, the idea that one could claim that this is not America's flag. But what I think is so interesting about this piece and so poignant and remains so true today is that he's challenging the ethnocentrism of the United States and calling itself America. And he reminds us here in conclusion to this wonderful series, and thanking my colleagues for participating with me, is that whether we're born in North America, Central America, or South America, todos somos americanos. We are all American.
Thank you, Vanessa. We have a couple questions we can get to. I think we have time. One was a question about Barbara Jones Hogu, and the person wanted to know where the prints were initially displayed. I assume that means right after, soon after she made them. Was there a show? It's probably where she worked, but do you know that, Genevra? I'm not sure.
Yeah, a lot of the early exhibitions of her work as these prints were being made, well, her one-woman artist shows often were at the South Side Community Arts Center in the South Side of Chicago. But the prints were also displayed as part of the Afro-Cobra exhibitions, and they had multiple exhibitions over the years. And those were, again, around the city of Chicago.
Starting around when, in the late 60s?
Starting about 1969, I believe.
Right, thank you. There's a kind of a long question for Vanessa about Cuban artists. Can you see the question, Vanessa? Do you want me to read it?
Let's see.
I can read it.
For Davidson, are there examples of the same concept of using a flag as a symbol of protest or symbol of statement found in the cadre of modern Cuban artists, specifically after 1965? At this time, the initial euphoria and excitement of the revolution began to clash with the realities of a new communist bureaucracy and the scarcity of goods, and the government began to be more oppressive, specifically towards artistic expression. I am thinking about artists like Antonia Iris, who was persecuted, however, much later. Certainly, there were, and one artist who I think is very important in this regard, not only in using images of flags, but using images taken from the historical iconography of Fidel Castro, is of course Jose Angel Toirac. I'm not sure if you're familiar with his work. He's represented in our collection as well, but what he does is to appropriate historical iconography and subtly transform it. He overlays images of Fidel at dinner with his cohorts, with images of propaganda for Coca-Cola and material goods. And he does this also with the flag. So yes, there are examples in Cuba, many more to explore. Thank you for the question.
There's another question about who paid for the Alfredo jar to be posted at Times Square. I think you said Public Art Fund, right?
That was the Public Art Fund, yes.
Well, Public Art Fund is a nonprofit, just like many museums, and it, along with Creative Time, are two of the most well-known public art, nonprofits in America that have long histories of doing these kinds of projects. So,
and
yeah.
Yes, and I should mention that it was recently reshown actually in Times Square in 2014. It's owned by the Guggenheim Museum now, and it was reshown in 2014 in Times Square, and then in 2016 in Piccadilly Circus in London, as well as Mexico City, and then in Colombia. So this is a very potent video that has symbolism that is still very, very real for people today to consider.
Right. I don't see any other questions. So unless someone wants to ask one now, I think we're about done. I want to thank everybody, my wonderful colleagues. You guys are so much fun to work with and so stimulating to work with. So thank you. And I guess we'll sign off. Thanks so much for attending. We got a great turnout, it looks like.
Actually, before you leave, there are a few reminders.
Oh, okay. Oh, reminders. I'm sorry. I'm not following the script. Thank you, Vanessa. Thanks for the reminder. I'm sorry. Don't stay on. Hang on. Don't hang on.
Hang on. Don't leave yet. Before you leave, here are a few reminders. To watch past curated conversations, take virtual art tours, and explore other #museum from home content, go to blantonmuseum.org/museum from home. If you'd like to show your support, you can become a member at blantonmuseum.org/membership, or you can support our Blanton Together Fund at blantonmuseum.org/support. A gift in any amount is appreciated and helps us bring cultural and educational resources to our community now while we're closed and when we eventually reopen. If you just want info about upcoming programs and other news, sign up for our newsletter at blantonmuseum.org/subscribe. And finally, if you have topics you'd like to see us cover in future curated conversations, drop us a line at media@blantonmuseum.org. Thanks again, and we hope to see you next Tuesday.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone.